Hello and welcome to this session. In this module, we focus on one of the most important justifications of government interventions in markets, that is externalities. So, market can function efficiently when private costs and benefits align with social costs and social benefits. But in many real world situations, these alignments break down. When a firm pollutes the environment or someone gets vaccinated and protects others, there are spillover effects, costs or benefits that fall on people not directly involved in the transaction. And these are called externalities. So, left unaddressed, externalities lead to inefficient outcomes, either too much harmful or too little of something beneficial. So this is where governments play a corrective role using tools like taxes to discourage negative externalities or subsidies to encourage positive ones. So in this session, we will explore how externalities distort market outcomes and how taxes and subsidies can help restore efficiency and what the broader implications are for public policy and business strategy. So let's get started. Let's first start with the proper definition for externalities. So externalities means when you consider a transaction between buyer and seller, a cost that is imposed on an individual or a group that is external to the transaction. So a benefit bestowed on an individual that is external to the transaction, that is the externality in terms of cost and benefit. So we are just seeing that when some of the transactions, for example, there is a transaction between a buyer and seller, and then the product that we are talking is, for example, tobacco. The tobacco smoking is actually creates pollution. The tobacco pollution is there, is affect the second hand smoking impact is there. So that a kind of negative externalities. So some of the examples here, firms that make paper also create a byproduct called a chemical called dioxin. So scientists believe that once dioxin enters the environment, it raises the population risk of cancer, birth defects, and other health problems. So thus, the production of paper creates a negative externality in society. Right. So that means those who get cancer or birth defects because of that, they are not a direct party in the paper production or its demander, but they get harmed by this one. So that is a negative externality in the society. So another example, a firm produces aluminum and also produces certain amount of pollutant as well, which it dumps into a river. So in this case, markets do many things well, but they do not do everything well here, because here when market produce aluminium, of course we need aluminium. We are the consumers of aluminium, we need it. But at the same time, during the production of aluminium, it also produces pollutant, and is dumped into a river. So here we examine why markets sometimes fail to allocate resources efficiently. So the point here is that sometimes is create negative externality, at the same time some cases it create positive externality as well, and it imposes on those who are not part of this transaction, those who are external to this transaction. And how to address this, what is the way out? Here government can sometimes improve market outcomes, and for this government can design and implement policies that can improve market allocation. So there are two types of externality. If the impact is adverse, the one we discussed is called negative externality. For example, release of dioxin into the environment. This is an example of negative externality. And in contrast to this, if the impact is beneficial, is called a positive externality. Suppose the R&D results developed by one firm may be used by other firms in the industry. And similarly, somebody is taking vaccine and because of the benefit is spill over to the rest of the people in the society, that there also it creates positive externalities. So the presence of externalities, buyers and sellers, they often neglect the external effects of their action when deciding how much to demand or supply. So the market equilibrium is not sufficient in those cases. So market equilibrium fails. In this case, market equilibrium fails to maximize the total benefit of society as a whole. Though we studied that, we already learned that market equilibrium maximize producer surplus and consumer surplus, and they produce optimum output. But when they generate externalities, though they maximize producer surplus and consumer surplus, but they do not maximize the societal benefit or the total benefits of society as a whole. So let's look into this. The example that we studied here, externalities, for each unit of aluminum produced, a certain amount of pollutant, that the smoke, enters the atmosphere and creates health risk. That we already seen that is a kind of negative externality. So how does this externality affect the efficiency of the market outcomes? Because here aluminum producing firms may not consider the cost of pollution that they create, therefore emit too much pollution. Hence, negative externality leads to inefficient production. Though we get aluminum in the market, but it comes at a social cost. The social cost is by emitting too much pollution. So, in this case, what the environmentalists argue that for a sustainable economic growth, we need to address the negative externality. There can be market failure. Market failure means there can be externalities in the production and consumption. So, if we list out this one, suppose what are the negative externalities? Negative externalities are mainly environmental damage is one. Another example is smoking. So, if we look at the production side, there is private cost. When we talk about the cost of production, mainly the firms report the private cost, means the inputs that they use, the labor they use, the land and capital they use, that the accounting costs that come into in their domain, that only they calculate, that the private cost they calculate. They ignore the social cost of production. Social cost of production is the pollution that we just mentioned. Similarly, in the case of consumption, in the consumption also, consumers, when they consume a product, they look into the private benefit that they are getting. Somebody is smoking, so they see the satisfaction that they are getting, but at the same, what is the social cost of consumption? The second-hand smoke the second-hand smoke it creates, that one is the societal cost of smoking. Moreover, not only that, even those who are smoking, even if they consume more healthcare products, healthcare costs, and it actually creates negative pressure that create welfare loss for their family, that also we can see that a kind of social cost of consumption. So overall, these are the negative externalities. But there are positive externalities as well. Suppose the mosquito nets. So if you are using mosquito nets, you are getting protected, and immunization and use of electric vehicles. These are all create positive externalities in the society. For example, when you use electric vehicle instead of diesel or petrol cars, you know that you are emitting less pollution, zero pollution into the environment as compared to those who are using fuel car, the petrol or diesel car. So that means those who are using, for example, electric vehicle, they are creating positive externalities. So here also you can distinguish between private vis-a-vis social benefits of production, as well as private versus social benefits of consumption. So in the case of simply, production also includes private benefit as well as social benefits. The one which I mentioned, electric vehicle use, when you use, you can use, of course you can use the vehicle and you get the transport services. At the same time, you also generate social benefits as well. So there is private benefits and social benefits. Similarly, there is private and social benefits of production. So for both production and consumption, there can be private and social implications, benefits. And due to negative externality, what happened here is that the social cost of producing aluminum, will be greater than private cost of aluminum producers. So for instance, here for each unit of output produced, the social cost is equal to the private cost to the aluminum producer, that the one when we say the cost of production, that is the one we normally compute, plus the unaccounted, that one is the cost of pollution, that also we need to add with the private cost, then we are going to get the social cost. So that means for each unit of output produced, each unit of aluminum produced, there are social costs involved. Social cost means private cost plus the cost of pollution in our example. So by the cost of pollution, we mean the health cost due to pollution. And these health costs are borne by external parties other than the buyer and seller of aluminum. So that means they are external to this transaction, and these costs are borne by them. So look at this diagram. So I'm just showing this one. Initially, this is the market equilibrium. So just look at the demand and supply framework. So this is the original supply curve. This is the original supply curve, and this is the original demand curve. So what you can see that this is the market determined quantity. This is the market determined quantity, and this is the market determined price. So, but what we saw here is that the P here is that is the on the supplies perspective, and this one is their cost. This is the cost for them. And what the thing is that there are some social cost as well. The social cost is this distance. This distance. This is the social cost. So when we put this one in the y-axis, this is P2, this is P1. So the distance between P2 and P1, that is the social cost. So actually, when we that the pollution cost, that actually the cost created by pollution. This distance is the cost created by pollution. So the total cost actually is not P1, not this P1, OP1. It should be OP2. That means OP1 plus P1 plus the cost of pollution plus this. So this is the total cost that we need to look at, not the until this point, that the P1. It should be including the cost of pollution. So adding this one, the social cost becomes P2, not P1. So if externalities ignored, what happened here is that the total surplus is maximized at price. So let us see, go back here. So in this case, we see that if you are left unaddressed, if you are completely leaving to the market, this is the quantity, the Q market is the output produced here. But if this one is addressed, and then the supply curve, if you consider that including the social cost as well, then the supply curve is this one, including the social cost. This is going to be the new supply curve, and new intersection is going to be this, and the price is going to be somewhere P naught here, and the quantity demanded and supplied intersect here. And if you are incorporating, considering the social cost as well, then the optimum output is Q optimum. This one is the optimum output, not the market determined output of this one. So as I mentioned here that this is the market output. If externality is taken into consideration, that the government or social planner would want to maximize the total surplus, so then the value to the consumers of aluminum minus the social cost of producing aluminum is that one. Here the social cost, it becomes private cost of the aluminum producers plus the cost of pollution. So if we consider this one, the cost of pollution, and impose a tax of this one, what is the equivalent amount of this one? That for example $2, and the $2 of tax is imposed, then what happened that the cost of the market price increases. When the market price increases, then this is the supply curve shift exactly upward to the left. Then this is the new intersection, and then the optimum quantity demanded and supply becomes this one. So that is after incorporating this pollution. That is the optimum output here. So the market equilibrium quantity in the original one, in this case, it is greater than the socially optimum quantity, that this one. So obviously you can see here is that this one is greater than this one. So in this case, the output produced at Q market, this one is inefficient in fact. because this is inefficient, because producers are producing more at lower cost, because they are not incorporating the social cost, the pollution that they are not incorporating here. So they neglect the cost of pollution. So actually the cost is much more than what the firms calculate. So in that way, if we incorporate that one, if you don't incorporate, the market equilibrium price is low at this point, and market equilibrium quantity is high this point. But we incorporate this pollution social cost, then what we are going to see that the market price is going to be high, when obviously you know that when the price is high, the demand declines. So the demand is going to decline and the optimum output will be produced. So in this case, Q optimum, this point is efficient. At this point, what you can see that it reflects social cost equal to private cost of production plus pollution cost. So in this case, optimal price is above the market equilibrium price, and the optimal quantity is less than the market equilibrium quantity. So in the presence of externality, how government can intervene here? So when market equilibrium is providing us an inefficient situation, so the government can achieve optimal outcome by imposing a tax. By imposing a tax equivalent to the cost of pollution, that would supply curve to the left upward. So that means the tax imposed, if it is equal to the external cost of production, equivalently the supply curve will be shifting leftwards to the up. So then the new supply curve would coincide with the social cost curve. In the new market equilibrium, aluminium producers would produce the socially optimal quantity of aluminium. So look at this. The first one is the supply curve and this is the demand curve. So here the supply curve shows private cost and the cost directly incurred by sellers, right? So this is what we just now discussed. And in this case, what you can see that this is the market determined output, that is 25 units, and the market price is 2.5 per unit of aluminium. So since this supply includes only the private cost, let's now bring the external cost, the value of the negative impact on society, in order to show that when we incorporate the social cost, you know that this much is the social cost, this much is the pollution, then accordingly the supply curve will be shifting leftwards to the up this much. That means including incorporating the social cost, that means private cost plus external cost, and this is going to be the new supply curve. So in this case, what can be done, that what is happening here is that if government imposes a tax, imposes equivalently this much amount of tax either on the producer or on the consumers, suppose they impose a tax on producers, so what happened that their cost of production increases, right? Their own cost of production plus the tax also becomes a component of their cost of production. So their cost of production increases. So when the cost of production increases, they sell the product at a higher price. But at the higher price, you know that demand is, the consumers are not going to buy the product at this higher price. Then the new intersection point is going to be here. So simply initially they are at equilibrium at this point 2.5. When government imposes a tax of this much, then what happened that the supply curve shift upward and the price is going to be 3.5, but at this price producers are getting only 2.5, right? One they are giving to the government, but is the cost of production. For them the total cost is 3.5, that including market price of 2.5 and 2.5 plus 1 is the tax here. But when the price is 3.5, consumers are not willing to buy, they are willing to buy only this much. You just look at the demand curve. So then the interaction, finally there will be a decline in price here, and then when the price decline, you can see that gradually quantity demanded gradually increases from here, and this is going to be the new equilibrium price. So here the price is going to be 3, that includes the tax of 1, then the market price of newly determined market price is going to be 2. So this is the illustration. So in this case, what you can see that the socially optimum quantity is 20 here, not the 25. So when government imposes tax You can see one market prices increases. When market prices increases, the new equilibrium quantity is 20 instead of 25. So in this case, the social cost and social benefit equate. This is going to be the new equilibrium point. So how to internalize this externality, that's what we discussed just now. So market participants can take account of the external effects of their action when government imposes a tax. A tax on sellers makes sellers cost is equal to private cost plus tax is equal to the social cost. So the social cost becomes the seller's cost when government imposes a tax here. So due to tax, market equilibrium is going to be at the socially optimum, not the market optimum one. So the one we discussed so far is negative externality. In addition, there can be positive externality as well. So there can be positive externality in consumption. So look at, for example, social benefits from vaccination. If someone gets vaccinated against a contagious disease and the person gets immunity, and the probability of getting the disease is reduced for other parties. So that means if I get vaccinated and suppose the person near to me didn't get vaccinated, and then he's not party, he's actually external to my vaccination, but the other person also get benefited because so my vaccination I get vaccinated. Because of that, I am now immune to contagious disease. So I am not becoming not a factor of disease spread here, epidemic here. So because of that, my neighbors also benefit since I have taken vaccination. So that is a simple example. So that is a positive externality in consumption. Similarly, there is positive externality in production as well. R&D results developed by one firm may be used by other firms in the industry. So thus there are social benefits from R&D conducted by a firm. So in the presence of a positive externality, the social value of a good includes not only the private value, that is the direct value to buyers, and external benefit, the value of the positive impact on others. So in this case, the socially optimal Q maximizes welfare. Any lower Q, the social value exceeds its cost, and any higher Q, the cost of the last unit exceeds its social value. So similar to the vaccination example, because the case that you are so much familiar, the electric vehicles, EV. So when you buy an EV, suppose you pay 10 lakhs for an EV, electric car, but you actually calculate only your private value, but at the same time, because since you buy electric vehicle, there is no pollution generated instead of the petrol car. So actually there you are making some external benefit. You are averting some of the pollution here, right? So in this case, just taking the case using a demand and supply framework, you just take a demand curve and this is the supply curve. And this is the market equilibrium price, 20 is the market equilibrium price, and 20 is the market equilibrium quantity. Here, suppose the external benefit, for example, per vaccine, the external benefit is, for example, 10 rupees. We are measuring it in terms of monetary terms. So when we draw, this is the demand supply curve that we are having. The demand curve that we are having is private benefit curve, because demand curve is the benefit valuation curve. This one is the private benefit, right? Similarly, this cost, yes, this supply curve is a private cost. Right now, just focus on the demand side, the positive externality. And suppose here, each point along this demand curve, consumers value this product based on their willingness to pay, right? So then drawing a social value curve, what we can do that, we can include what is the external benefits is generating. Since we said that the social value, for example, in the case of vaccine, the social value is the private benefit. For example, at this point unit, for example, 5 units they value that is worth 35 rupees, is worth for paying 35 rupees at this 5 units. And this is the private value that they are assessing. So when we include the external benefit, the externality, that is the 10, then actually the social welfare, social benefit is going to be the new demand curve, that the green color line, demand curve. This is going to be the new demand curve, that by including the external benefits. So that is the social demand curve, the social value or social valuation. That is the social demand curve, societal demand curve we can call. And then how to internalize. If suppose if there is no government intervention, we are going to be, the equilibrium point is going to be this, and we are going to demand only 20 and price is going to be 20, right? But since it's generating some societal welfare, the private individuals are not going to spend more, but they are not aware of this one. They are not that conscious and social conscious. And here government need to intervene. How? Because by consuming 20 units, the society value 20 rupees, but societal benefit is 30. It is actually creating more social benefits. So in order to internalize this positive externality, government can use subsidy. Since the societal benefit is, for example, per vaccine, is creating a benefit of 10, the equivalent amount government can give subsidy to either to the producers or consumers. So in this case, clearly what we can see that this much can be the subsidy, this subsidy can be given, and this is going to be the new equilibrium point. And then accordingly, producers are there getting subsidy, then going to be 25 is going to be the new output. And now people are willing to demand more because they are not now paying price, for example 15 only, right? But because government is now giving them 10 subsidy, so because of that the actual price they are paying is only 15. Now they demand 25 unit instead of 20. And I have given you some cases here to do as a homework. Consider the market for fire extinguishers. Do fire extinguishers exhibit externalities? You just work it out and illustrate. Using this idea, you illustrate market equilibrium and socially optimum equilibrium using a demand and supply framework. So idea here is that even though people buy them for their own use, they prevent fire from damaging the property of others. So that means it's creating a positive externality. So in this case, government can give what is the social benefit here? Equivalent amount can be given as subsidy by the government. So here some more illustrative examples I am pointing out. Greater consumption of alcohol leads to more accident. Then in this case, you can see that government can increase the price by imposing tax. Then again, using the supply and demand framework, you can estimate the market equilibrium, and socially optimum equilibrium. So to conclude, what we are done in this section is that we examine how externalities, both positive and negative, lead to market failures. So we saw that subsidies can encourage greater production and consumption of goods with the positive externalities, and while taxes can discourage overproduction of goods with the negative externalities. So by aligning private incentives with the social cost or benefits, these policies tools help move the market toward socially optimum outcomes, then or improving overall social welfare. And thanks for watching this session, giving close attention to the content, and see you in the next session. Thank you.